Hi, everybody, and happy Monday. It's another week. My name is John Nachlinger. I am the owner of Netsquire. We are a law firm in New Jersey that is devoted to helping people get divorced without fighting. So today I'm going to talk to you about alimony, which causes some of the most intense fighting in a divorce. Because I get a lot of questions about, am I entitled to alimony? How much am I entitled to? How long am I going to get it? How do I avoid paying alimony? So I just want to get through some of the myths and things that are out there that I know are percolating on the internet, in Google land or Bing land or wherever it is that you search about alimony, because there's a lot of misconceptions. First thing that you need to know is that no one is entitled to alimony just because you were married, okay? You're not entitled to alimony. Alimony is based upon a number of factors. And so I'm not going to bore you with what the factors are, but let's just say that they involve what was your marital standard of living, and then they involve the ability of someone to pay and someone's need for money. So basically, we look at all those factors and decide, should there be alimony? How much alimony should there be? And how long should the alimony be paid? So there's a lot of different things that go on. So think of alimony like this. You're married for 10 years and somebody leaves the workforce to care for children and then goes back to work 5 years later, maybe at a lower income or an income that they was lower than they would have been had they been continuing to work. Whereas the other person continued to work and get raises every year. And now you are after 10 years, one person's making $100,000 a year, the other one's making $45,000 a year. Okay, that is a perfect setup for an alimony case, because you've got somebody whose earning capacity has continued to increase. You have somebody else's who has been stagnant because they had children. And now we have a situation where their marital standard of living was based upon them making $150,000 a year. Now they're getting divorced, and you've got one person who's sitting there with $45,000 a year. The other one's sitting there with $100,000 a year. And so in order to maintain the marital standard of living so that they each can maintain something that's similar, there needs to be some money from the higher earner to the lower earning. That is an alimony traditional setup. So does it always have to be a situation where somebody was taking care of children? No, you don't have to have children to qualify for alimony. It could just very well be that one person's career really took off and really increased over the course of a 15, 20-year marriage. And the other one was just sort of more steady, very small increases in income. The marital, enterprise or partnership still enabled one person to make more money. So it really, having children doesn't matter, but I just want you to know that having children is a factor that can go into play. And that's why it's multifactorial. But when I get a call and I say, I want to know how much alimony I'm entitled to, that is the wrong question. No, because no one's entitled to it. It's really, how much alimony do you need to maintain a lifestyle that is reasonably similar to the marital standard of living? And we're going to be looking at, like I said, a bunch of factors. So how much is the big question? The big $1 million question is how much? Well, there is a unofficial formula that is used to at least give a baseline of sort of an area to look at in terms of how much should be paid. But this formula is not condoned by the court system. It does not appear in any of our laws, doesn't appear in court decisions. It is really just a rule of thumb, just so that you're not just fighting over, numbers in the air. And so typically what you will see is somewhere in like that 22 to 28% of the difference in the gross incomes of the parties range. Now, I don't want you to get confused and think that, okay, if my spouse makes 90 and I make 80, I get, 25% of the difference in our incomes in alimony every year. That is not what I'm saying. Because like I said, just because you're married and just because one person earns a little bit more than the other doesn't mean that it's an alimony case, because you do not just get alimony because you are married. So, but if you want sort of a baseline, go back to that example I just used a minute ago with one person making 100, the other one person making 45. If you take that $55,000 difference in income and you apply some percentage somewhere in the mid-20s, 22 to 28%, you're going to get at least a number to start talking about what alimony should be. And the only reason I like to give a rule of thumb is because, as anyone who has consumed any of our social media knows, I am the biggest proponent of mediation. I do not think anyone should be going to court and fighting. It's a complete waste of your money, because what I just told you in terms of what to expect with alimony, you could resolve day one. By just coming up with a number that makes sense, or you can, fight for a year, spend tens of thousands of dollars just to get to a point where you're going to hear the same thing at the end of the day. So that at least will give you a baseline of sort of where you need to be. Now, what does that number have to be? Like I said, it's not an official formula. So I can't tell you the answer is 27% or the answer is 23%, or the answer is not 30% or 20%, because those numbers are based upon what we talked about before, your marital standard of living and your needs based upon, what's going on. And whether you have children living with you primarily, that could come into play. Because let's say you have a house, you need a house with 3 bedrooms because you've got 3 kids, and we have to make sure they're not all crammed into one room. That might impact the amount of money you need, even with child support, in order to be able to maintain the house for your children. So a lot of different factors come into play. It's not super easy to decide how much it should be, but at least that'll give you a baseline. So if you're sitting talking to your spouse and you're like, okay, listen, we want to get divorced without fighting, to be amicable. We want to call John's office and just have them draft up the papers after we make a decision. A good place to start is somewhere in the mid-20s in terms of percentage of the difference in your gross incomes. It's a good place to start, but you have to peel the onion a little bit more and decide, does that number make sense in the totality of everything that's going on? Because don't forget, you also have other assets. You have the marital home in most cases, and all of those pieces are a puzzle, and you have to put them all together. And alimony is one piece of that puzzle. It could be just paid monthly or weekly, or it could not be paid at all in exchange for something else happening, like maintaining a house or something like that. So we just keep that in mind. Now let's talk about duration, because this is a big one. So there used to be something called permanent alimony. We don't have permanent alimony anymore. We have something called open durational alimony. And you're like, well, John, that sounds exactly like the same thing. It's not. And the reason it's not is because beforehand, getting alimony terminated was very difficult. It was very onerous. I really feel like people were punished with alimony, as opposed to it being a bridge from the end of the relationship into the next part of their life. It was really used as a punishment, because people with relatively short marriages were paying alimony forever. Well, now with this concept called open durational alimony, there is an escape hatch when you reach full Social Security retirement age. So there is something built into the law that sort of allows you to get out as long as you retire at an age that the courts and the state legislature of New Jersey thinks was appropriate for you to get out, usually 67. So there's at least something now that allows you to get out without having to sort of prove everything about why you're no longer working. So to qualify for open durational alimony, your marriage has to be at least 20 years long. There are special circumstances where it could be less than 20 years, but they're very rare. Don't even worry about those. For purposes of our conversation, if you've been married more than 20 years, then you're going to have open durational alimony. But it's very likely your alimony will be over, either receiving or paying, when the payer reaches full Social Security retirement age. So, if you've been married for 35 years and each one of you is 60 years old, well, it's open durational, but likely within the next decade, it's going to probably terminate, because you're both going to retire. You're going to split all your retirement assets. Maybe your Social Security payments will be very similar. There's going to be a lot of reasons why it probably will terminate. Most people just agree to terminate alimony at a certain age just because it makes sense. You don't want to create more conflict in the future if you can avoid it. Now, what about if you're less than 20 years? So if you're less than 20 years, you're going to be paying limited duration alimony. Now, the only guidance that our law gives us is one thing, is that you cannot pay longer than the length of time you were married. Does that help you? That's the only guidance we get. Other states have formulas, but New Jersey, in its infinite wisdom, has decided to create more places where we can fight, and has just said that it just can't be longer than you were married. So let's take the 10-year marriage again. So a 10-year marriage, limited duration alimony, again, we said $100,000, $45,000, the incomes of the parties. So the longest alimony could possibly be is 10 years. Now, is it going to be 10 years? Very unlikely. I mean, it could be. You could agree for 10 years. So it's something short of that. Now, people have different opinions about this, but again, more of a rule of thumb is if it's 10 years or less, think about half the length of the marriage being sort of the cap of how long you're going to pay. And by the way, if you've been married for a year, I know the law doesn't say that there's no alimony after a year. Don't be asking for alimony after a year of marriage. People do it all the time. It's poor form. Just don't do it. There's really no reason for it, unless there's something very specific that happened during that year, permanent disability or something very unique that happened. If you're just regular people and you have the same job coming out of the marriage that you did going in, don't be asking for alimony. But so like 10 years or less, about half the length of the marriage. If you're like in that 10 to 15 range, then maybe more like 60 to 70% of the marriage. And if you're in that 15 to 20 range, you're probably getting closer to paying around the length of the marriage, maybe a few years shy of that. But when it comes to limited duration alimony, we're really looking at how long it's going to take to, again, bridge you from the end of the marriage to the next part of your life. So what does that mean? A lot of times we'll peg it to maybe when children are out of college. So let's say you're getting married, you've been married 15 years and you've got two kids that are, let's say 13 and 15. Well, a 13-year-old needs about 9 years, right? About 9 years. I'm trying to do the math in my head. About 9 years to get through high school and then college. So even though you've been married for 13 or 14 years, maybe 9 years, somewhere around there is the right number, because after that, there's no child-related expenses. There's no children you have to worry about. Sometimes we tie it to that. Sometimes you just tie it to, the end of high school. It could just be tied to some arbitrary time. So I know that's not a ton of guidance. Just understand that there is no formula. So you have to agree. Just like there is no official formula on the amount, there's no official formula on the duration. So you have to figure out a way that makes sense. And there's, like I said, these are some of the guidelines, but this is what we do in mediation, is we sort of we don't look at percentages. We actually look at your budgets. We look at how much you spent, how much do you have, and sort of see what makes sense. Because if you have children, you're also going to have child support that's part of this discussion. So you have to make sure that you're looking at both sides of the coin to make sure that the final outcome is fair and equitable and allows both parties to maintain, a lifestyle that is appropriate, particularly if you have kids. I mean, you want the kids to have a similar experience at both houses. And I know people look at alimony as a punishment. We have to make sure that we're not using it as a punishment. And that goes back to, just because you got married doesn't mean you get alimony. But I think at the end of the day, if you look at whether or not you should be paying alimony, it's usually fairly clear that it's appropriate in your situation. And as long as you can get past that threshold of, I'm going to owe alimony, usually the rest of it can line up. Most people tend to be fair, particularly if you resolve things without fighting early in the process with a mediator like myself. We can usually find a resolution that makes sense, where people are guided more about fairness and less about, emotional decisions, asking for alimony because I'm entitled to it, or you did this to me, or you did that to me. So the earlier you can have these conversations, the earlier you can come up with something that makes sense, that's fair to both of you, the more likely you're not going to be fighting about these issues. And that is really the goal here, because it does no good to fight about, $25 a week in alimony difference between what each party wants if you've both spent $25,000 on legal fees. It's just, I think anyone listening can understand that is just silly. So try to resolve your things early. Use some of what you just heard in this video as a guide of how you could sort of start discussing the concept of alimony, and then figure out something that makes sense for your family. And there's no law that says that alimony has to be called alimony. And there's not something that you have to be paying child support. You can be creative and just come up with an amount that covers everything that you just call support. You can do anything you want in an agreement. The key, though, is that you need to have an experienced divorce attorney drafting your agreement, making sure that your agreement has enough safeguards in it to protect both of you from whatever decision you make. So if you guys decide you want to do something creative, that's fine. The agreement just needs to specify exactly why you did it, how you did it, so that if for whatever reason down the road a judge or somebody looks at your agreement, it's very clear why you did it and how you did it, so that everyone's protected in the future and someone doesn't get a second bite of the apple, which is certainly something you don't want to do. All right, so that's today's lesson on alimony. I know it was quick and dirty, but alimony doesn't have to be complicated. It can be quick and dirty. Just be guided by fairness. Do not be guided by what I'm entitled to. If I have to hear that phrase one more time, I'm just gonna scream. You're not entitled to anything. It's more of is there a need for it? If there's a need for it, then there should be alimony. All right. If you have any questions or if you need any help, please feel free to direct message us. We are always here to help.